Tonight, the valley feels different again, not unfinished, not unresolved, but remembered. After every journey through wilderness, there comes a quieter walk back, a slower step, a deeper understanding of what the silence truly meant. If you have traveled through all the parts before this one, you may feel it now. This is no longer a story of movement. It is a story of reflection. Welcome back to the Three Rivers country. If this is your first night here, you have arrived in the calm after the storm that never shouted. You do not need to know every event that came before. Just listen, because sometimes the softest chapters are the ones that stay with us the longest. Before we continue, take one slow breath and let it fall away gently. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your thoughts grow distant. There is nothing left to solve here, only the quiet meaning that remains. In part 11, the valley offers something different. Not action, not tension, but understanding. And understanding in the wilderness comes slowly. Allow the words to guide you. Allow sleep to arrive whenever it chooses. Now, we return once more to the silence that shaped this journey. Part. Her face was flushed pink. She had not taken time to brush her hair, but had woven it carelessly into a thick braid that fell down her back. She gave a little exclamation of mock disappointment when she saw Kent. "Why, did not you wait?" she remonstrated. "I wanted to surprise you." "You have," he said, "and I could not wait. I had to come in and help." He was inside the door and on his knees beside her as he reached for the two forks, his lips pressed against her hair. The pink deepened in Merritt's face, and the soft little note that was like laughter came into her throat. Her hand caressed C's cheek as she rose to her feet, and Kent laughed back. And after that, as she arranged things on the shelf table, her hand now and then touched his shoulder or his hair, and 2 or 3 times he heard that wonderful little throat note that sent through him a wild pulse of happiness. And then, he sitting in the low chair and she on the stool, they drew close together before the board that answered as a table and ate their breakfast. Marette poured his coffee and stirred sugar and condensed milk in it, and so happy was Kent that he did not tell her he used neither milk nor sugar in his coffee. The morning sun burst through the little window, and through the open door Kent pointed to the glory of it on the river and in the shimmering green of the forests slipping away behind. When they had finished, Marette went outside with him. For a space she stood silent and at a wild movement, looking upon the mouthless world that encompassed them. It seemed to Kent that for a few moments she did not breathe. With her head thrown back and her white throat bare to the soft balsam-laden air, she faced the forests. Her eyes became suddenly filled with the luminous glow of stars. Her face reflected the radiance of the rising sun, and Kent, looking at her, knew that he had never seen her so beautiful as in these wonderful moments. He held his own breath, for he also knew that Niskia, his goddess, was looking upon her own world again after a long time away, her world and his, different from all the other worlds God had ever made, different even from the world only a few miles behind them at the landing, for here was no sound or whisper of destroying human life. They were in the embrace of the great North. It was drawing them closer, and with each minute nearer to the mighty, pulsing heart of it. The forests hung heavy and green and glistening with the wet of storm. Out of them came the tremulous breath of life and the glory of living. They hugged the shores like watchful hosts, guarding the river from civilization. And suddenly the girl held out her arms, and Kent heard the low, thrilling cry that came to her lips. She had forgotten him. She had forgotten everything but the river, the forests, and the untrod worlds beyond them. And he was glad, for this world that she was welcoming, that her soul was crying out to, was his world, forever and ever. It held his dreams, his hopes, all the desires that he had in life. And when at last Marek turned toward him slowly, his arms were reaching out to her, and in his face she saw that same glory which filled her own. "I'm glad, glad," she cried softly. "Oh, James, I'm glad." She came into his arms without hesitation. Her hands stroked his face, and then she stood with her head against his shoulder, looking ahead, breathing deeply now of the sweet, clear air, filled with the elixir of the hovering forests. She did not speak or move, and Kent remained quiet. The scow drifted around a bend. Shoreward, a great moose splashed up part of the water, and they could hear him afterward, crashing through the forest. After a little he heard her whisper, "It has been a long time, James. I have been away 4 years. I was lonely down there. There were so many people and so many things that I was homesick for the woods and mountains. I believe I would have died soon. There were only 2 things I loved, James." "What?" he asked. "Pretty dresses and shoes." His arms closed about her a little more tightly. I understand," he laughed softly. "That is why you came, that first time, with pretty high-heeled pumps." He bowed his head, and she turned her face to him. On her upturned mouth, he kissed her. "More than any other man ever loved a woman, I love you, Niska, little goddess," he cried. The minutes and the hours of that day stood out ever afterward in Kent's life as unforgettable memories. There were times when they seemed illusory and unreal, as though he lived and breathed in an insubstantial world made up of gossamer things, which must be the fabric of dream. These moments when the black shadow of the tragedy from which they were fleeing pressed upon him, when the thought came to him that they were criminals racing with the law, that they were not on enchanted ground but in deadly peril, that it was all a fool's paradise from which some terrible shock would shortly awaken him. But these periods of apprehension were, in themselves, mere shadows thrown for a moment upon his happiness. Again and again, the subconscious force within him pounded home to his physical brain the great truth that it was all extraordinarily real. He could not quite yet comprehend the fullness of that love which she had given him, more than ever, in the glory of this love that had come to them. She was like a child to him. It seemed to him in the first hours of the morning that she had forgotten yesterday, and the day before, and ill the days before that. She was going home. She whispered that to him so often that it became a little song in his brain. Yet she told him nothing of that home, and he waited, knowing that the fulfillment of her promise was not far away. And there was no embarrassment in the manner of her surrender when he held her in his arms, and she held her face up so that he could kiss her mouth and look into her glowing, lovely eyes. What he saw was the flush of a great happiness, the almost childish confession of it, along with the woman's joy of possession. And he thought of Kedsty, and of the law that was rousing itself into life back at Athabasca Landing. And then she ran her fingers through his own, told him to wait, and ran into the cabin, and came out a moment later with her brush. And after that she seated herself at the fulcrum of the big sweep, and began to brush out her hair in the sun. "I am glad you love it, James," she said. She unbound the thick braid and let the silken strands of it run caressingly between her fingers. She smoothed it out, brushed it, until it was more beautiful than he had ever seen it in that glow of the sun. She held it up so that it rippled out in shimmering cascades about her, and then, suddenly, Ken saw the short tress from which had been clipped the rope of hair that he had taken from Kedsty's neck, and as his lips tightened, crushing fiercely the exclamation of his horror, there came a trembling happiness from Moret's lips, scarcely more than the whisper of a song, the low, thrilling melody of Le Chaudière. Her arms reached up, and she drew his head down to her, so that for a time his visions were blinded in that sweet smother of her hair. The intimacy of that day was in itself like a dream. Hour after hour they drifted deeper into the great north. The sun shone. The forest-walled shores of the river grew mightier in their stillness and their grandeur, and the vast silence of unpeopled places brooded over the world. To Kent, it was as if they were drifting through paradise. Occasionally, he found it necessary to work the big sweep, for still water was gradually giving way to a swifter current. Beyond that, there was no labor for him to perform. It seemed to him that with each of these wonderful hours, danger was being left farther and still farther behind them. Watching the shores, looking ahead, listening for sound that might come from behind, at times possessed of the exquisite thrills of children. In their happiness, Kent and Moret found the gulf of strangeness passing swiftly away from between them. They did not speak of Kedsty, or the tragedy, or again of the death of John Barclay, but Kent told of his days in the north, of his aloneness, of the wild, weird love in his soul for the deepest wildernesses, And from that he went away back into dim and distant yesterdays, alive with mellowed memories of boyhood days spent on a farm. To all these things Maret listened with glowing eyes, with low laughter, or with breath that rose or fell with his own emotions. She told of her own days down at school, and of their appalling loneliness, of childhood spent in the forests, of the desire to live there always. But she did not speak intimately of herself or her life in its more vital aspects. She said nothing of the home in the valley of silent men, nothing of father or mother, sisters or brothers. There was no embarrassment in her omissions, and Kent did not question. He knew that those were among the things she would tell him when that promised hour came, the hour when he would tell her they were safe. I should leave the river and take to the forests. He explained to Maret why they could not float on indefinitely. The river was the one great artery through which ran the blood of all trafficked to the far north. It was patrolled. Sooner or later, they would be discovered. In the forests, with 1,000 untrod trails to choose, they would be safe. He had only one reason for keeping to the river, until they passed through the death chute. It would carry them beyond a great swampy region to the westward, through which it would be impossible for them to make their way at this season of the year. Otherwise, he would have gone ashore now. He loved the river, had faith in it, but he knew that not until the deep forest swallowed them, as a vast ocean swallows a ship, would they be beyond the peril that threatened them from the landing. 3 or 4 times between sunrise and noon, they saw life ashore and on the stream. Once a scow tied to a tree, then an Indian camp, and twice trappers' shacks, built in the edge of little clearings. With the beginning of afternoon, Kent felt growing within him something that was not altogether eagerness. It was at times a disturbing emotion, a foreshadowing of evil, a warning for him to be on his guard. He used the sweep more to help their progress in the current, and he began to measure time and distance with painstaking care. He recognized many landmarks. By 4 o'clock, or 5 at the latest, they would strike the head of the chute. 10 minutes of its thrilling passage, and he would work the scow into the concealment he had in mind ashore, and no longer would he fear the arm of the law that reached out from the landing. As he planned, he listened. From noon on, he never ceased to listen for that distant put, put, put that would give them a mile's warning of the approach of the patrol launch. He did not keep his plans to himself. Maret sensed his growing uneasiness, and he made her a partner of his thoughts. If we hear the patrol before we reach the chute, we will still have time to run ashore, he assured her, and they will not catch us. We will be harder to find than 2 needles in a haystack, but it is best to be prepared. So he brought out his pack and Maret's smaller bundle, and laid his rifle and pistol holster across them. It was 3 o'clock when the character of the river began to change, and Kent smiled happily. They were entering upon swifter waters. There were places where the channel narrowed, and they sped through rapids. Only where unbroken straight waters stretched out ahead of them did Kent give his arms a rest at the sweep, and through most of the straight water he added to the speed of the scow. Maret helped him. In him, the exquisite thrill of watching her slender, glorious body as it worked with his own never grew old. She laughed at him over the big oar between them. The wind and sun played riot in her hair. Her parted lips were rose red, her cheeks flushed, her eyes like sun-warmed rock violets. More than once, in the thrill of that afternoon flight, as he looked at the marvelous beauty of her, he asked himself if it could be anything but a dream. And more than once he laughed joyously and paused in his swinging of the sweep and proved that it was real and true, and Kent thanked God and worked harder. Once, a long time ago, Marette told him she had been through the chute. It had horrified her then. She remembered it as a sort of death monster. As they drew nearer to it, Kent told her more about it. Only now and then was a life lost there now, he said. At the mouth of the chute, there was a great, knife-like rock, like a dragon's tooth, that cut the chute into two roaring channels. If the scow kept to the left-hand channel, it was safe. There would be a mighty roaring and thundering as it swept on its passage. But that roaring of the chute, he told her, was like the barking of a harmless dog. Only when a scow became unmanageable, or hit the dragon's tooth, or made the right-hand channel instead of the left, was there tragedy. There was that delightful little note of laughter in Marette's throat when Kent told her that. You mean, it seems, that if one of three possible things does not happen, we will get through safely. None of them is possible with us, he corrected himself quickly. We have a tight little scow, we are not going to hit the rock, and we will make the left-hand channel so smoothly you will not know when it happens. He smiled at her with splendid confidence. I have been through it 100 times, he said. He listened. Then suddenly, he drew out his watch. It was 4:15. Marette's ears caught what he heard. In the air was a low, trembling murmur. It was growing slowly but steadily. He nodded when she looked at him, the question in her eyes. The rapids at the head of the chute, he cried, his voice vibrant with joy. We have beat them out. We're safe. They swung around a bend, and the white spume of the rapids lay half a mile ahead of them. The current began to race with them now. Kent put his whole weight on the sweep to keep the scow in mid-channel. We are safe, he repeated. Do you understand, Marette? We're safe. He was speaking the words for which she had waited, was telling her that at last the hour had come when she could keep her promise to him. The words, as he gave them voice, thrilled him. He felt like shouting them. And then all at once, he saw the change that had come into her face. Her wide, startled eyes were not looking at him, but beyond. She was looking back in the direction from which they had come. And even as he stared, her face grew white. Listen, she was tense, rigid. He turned his head, and in that moment it came to him, above the growing murmur of the river, the put, put up the police patrol boat from Athabasca Landing. When Marette took her eyes from the river and looked at him, his face was like carven rock. He was staring dead ahead. "We cannot make the shoot," he said, his voice sounding hard and unreal to her. "If we do, it will be up with us before we can land at the other end. We must let this current drive us ashore." Now, as he made his decision, he put the strength of his body into action. He knew there was not the 100th part of a second to lose. The outreaching suction of the rapids was already gripping the scow, and with mighty strokes he fought to work the head of his craft toward the westward shore. With swift understanding, Marette saw the priceless value of a few seconds of time. If they were caught in the stronger swirl of the rapids before the shore was reached, they would be forced to run the chute, and in that event, the launch would be upon them before they could make a landing farther on. She sprang to Kent's side and added her own strength in the working of the sweep. Foot by foot and yard by yard, the scow made precious westing, and Kent's face lighted up with triumph as he nodded ahead to a timbered point that thrust itself out like a stubby thumb into the river. Beyond that point, the rapids were frothing white, and they could see the first black walls of rock that marked the beginning of the chute. "We will make it," he smiled confidently. "We will hit that timbered point close inshore. I do not see where the launch can make a landing anywhere within a mile of the chute. And once ashore, we will make trail about 5 times as fast. They can follow it." Marette's face was no longer pale, but flushed with excitement. He caught the white gleam of teeth between her parted lips. Her eyes shone gloriously, and he laughed. "You beautiful little fighter," he cried exultantly. You... His words were cut short by a snap that was like the report of a pistol close to his ears. He pitched forward and crashed to the bottom of the scow. Marette's slim body clutched in his arms as he fell. In a flash they were up, and mutely they stared where the sweep had been. The blade of it was gone. Kent was conscious of hearing a little cry from the girl at his side, and then her fingers were gripping tightly again about his thumb. No longer possessed of the power of guidance, the scow swung sideways. It swept past the wooded point. The white maelstrom of the lower rapids seized upon it, and Kent, looking ahead to the black maw of the death trap that was waiting for them, drew Marette close in his arms and held her tight. Chapter 22. For a brief space, after the breaking of the scow sweep, Kent did not move. He felt Marette's arms closing tighter and tighter around his neck. He caught a flash of her upturned face, the flush of a few moments before, replaced by a deathly pallor, and he knew that without explanation on his part, she understood the almost hopeless situation they were in. He was glad of that. It gave him a sense of relief to know that she would not go into a panic, no matter what happened. He bowed his face to hers so that he felt the velvety smoothness of her cheek. She turned her mouth to him, and they kissed. His embrace was crushing for a moment, fierce with his love for her, and desperate with his determination to keep her from harm. His brain was working swiftly, There was possibly one chance in 10 that the scow, rudderless and without human guidance, would sweep safely between the black walls and jagged teeth of the chute. Even if the scow made this passage, they would be in the power of the police unless some splendid whimsicality of fate sent it ashore before the launch came through. On the other hand, if it was carried far enough through the lower rapids, they might swim, and there was the rifle laying across the pack. That, after all, was his greatest hope if the scow made the passage of the chute. The bulwarks of the scow would give them greater protection than the thinner walls of the launch would give to their pursuers. In his heart there raged suddenly a hatred for that law of which he had been a part. It was running them to destruction, and he would fight. There would not be more than 3 men in the launch, and he would kill them. The killing became a necessity. They were speeding like an unbridled racehorse through the boiling rapids now. The clumsy craft, under their feet, twisted and turned. The dripping tops of great rocks shot past a little out of their channel, and Maret, with one arm still about his neck, was facing the peril ahead with him. They could see the dragon's tooth, black and grim, waiting squarely in their path. In another 120 seconds, they would be upon it, or past it. There was no time for Kent to explain. He sprang to his pack, whipped a knife from his pocket, and cut the stout babiche rope that reinforced its straps. In another instant, he was back at Maret's side, fastening the babiche about her waist. The other end he gave to her, and she tied it about his wrist. She smiled as she finished the knot. It was a strange, tense little smile, but it told him that she was not afraid, that she had great faith in him, and knew what the babiche meant. "I can swim, James," she cried. "If we'll strike the rock." She did not finish, because of the sudden cry that came to his lips. He had almost forgotten the most vital of all things. There was not time to unlace his boots. With his knife he cut the laces in a single downward thrust. Swiftly he freed his own feet and Maret's. Even in this hour of their peril, it thrilled him to see how quickly Maret responded to the thoughts that moved him. She tore at her outer garments and slipped them off as he wriggled out of his heavy shirt. A slim, white underskirted little thing, her glorious hair flying in the wind that came through the chute, her throat and arms bare, her eyes shining at Kent. She came again close within his arms, and her lips framed softly his name, and a moment later she turned her face up and cried quickly, "Kiss me, James, kiss me." Her warm lips clung to his, and her bare arms encircled his neck with the choking grip of a child's. He looked ahead and braced himself on his feet, and after that he buried one of his hands in the soft mass of her hair and pressed her face against his naked breast. 10 seconds later, the crash came. Squarely midships, the scow struck the dragon's tooth. Kent was prepared for the shock, but his attempt to hold his feet, with Marette in his arms, was futile. The bulwark saved them from crashing against the slippery face of the rock itself. Amid the roar of water that filled his ears, he was conscious of the rending of timbers. The scow bulged up with the mighty force beneath, and for a second or two it seemed as though that force was going to overturn and submerge it. Then slowly it began to slip off the nose of the rock. Holding to the rail with one hand and clinging to Marette with his other arm, Kent was gripped in the horror of what was happening. The scow was slipping into the right-hand channel. Into the channel there was no hope, only death. Marette was squarely facing the thing ahead. In this hour, when each second held a lifetime of suspense, Kent saw that she understood. Yes, she did not cry out. Her face was dead white. Her hair and arms and shoulders were dripping with the splash of water. But she was not terrified as he had seen terror. When she turned her eyes to him, he was amazed by the quiet, calm look that was in them. Her lips trembled. His soul expressed itself in a wordless cry that was drowned in another crash of timber as a jutting snag of the tooth crumpled up a little cabin as if it had been pasteboard. He felt overwhelming him the surge of a thing mightier than the menace of the chute. He could not lose. It was inconceivable, impossible. With her to fight for, this slim, wonderful creature who smiled at him even as she saw death. And then, as his arm closed still more tightly about her, the monsters of power and death gave him their answer. The scow swung free of the dragon's tooth, half filled with water. Its cracked and broken carcass was caught in the rock jaws of the eastern channel. It ceased to be a floating thing. It was inundation, dissolution, utter obliteration, almost without shock. And Kent found himself in the thundering rush of waters, holding to Marette. For a space they were under. Black water and white froth fumed and exploded over them. It seemed an age before fresh air filled Kent's nostrils. He thrust Marette upward and cried out to her. He heard her answer, "I am all right." James, his swimming prowess, was of little avail now. He was like a chip. All his effort was to make of himself a barrier between Mamet's soft body and the rocks. It was not the water itself that he feared, but the rocks. There were scores and hundreds of them, like the teeth of a mighty grinding machine, and the jaw was 1/4 mile in length. He felt the first shock, the second, the third. He was not thinking of time or distance, but was fighting solely to keep himself between Marette and death. The first time he failed, a blind sort of rage burned in his brain. He saw her white body strained over a slippery, deluge-worn rock. Her head was flung back, and he saw the long masses of her hair streaming out in the white froth, and he thought for an instant that her fragile body had been broken. He fought still more fiercely after that, and she knew for what he was fighting. Only in an unreal sort of way was he conscious of shock and hurt. It gave him no physical pain. Yet he sensed the growing dizziness in his head, an increasing lack of strength in his arms and body. They were halfway through the chute when he shot against a rock with terrific force. The contact tore Maret from him. He plunged for her, missed his grip, and saw her opposite him, clinging to the same rock. The babiche rope had saved her. Fastened about her waist and tied to his wrist, it still held them together, with the 5 feet of rock between them, panting, air life half beaten out of them. Their eyes met over that rock. Now that he was out of the water, the blood began streaming from Kent's arms and shoulders and face, but he smiled at her, as a few moments before she had smiled at him. Her eyes were filled with the pain of his hurts. He nodded back in the direction from which they had come. "We are out of the worst of it," he tried to shout. "As soon as we have got our wind, I will climb over the rock to you. It will not take us longer than a couple of minutes, perhaps less, to make the quiet water at the end of the channel." She heard him and nodded her reply. He wanted to give her confidence, and he had no intention of resting, for her position filled him with a terror which he fought to hide. The babiche rope, not half as large around as his little finger, had swung her to the downstream side of the rock. It was the slender thread of buckskin and his own weight that were holding her. If the buckskin should break, he thanked God that it was the tough babiche that had been around his pack. An inch at a time, he began to draw himself up on the rock. The undertow behind the rock flung a mass of Maret's long hair toward him, so that it was a foot or two nearer to him than her clinging hands. He worked himself toward that, for he saw that he could reach it more quickly than he could reach her. At the same time, he had to keep his end of the babiche taut. It was, from the beginning, an almost superhuman task. The rock was slippery as oil. Twice his eyes shot downstream, with the thought that it might be better to cast himself bodily into the water, and after that draw Maret to him by means of the babiche. What he saw convinced him that such action would be fatal. He must have Maret in his arms. If he lost her, even for a few seconds, the life would be beaten from her body in that rock-strewn maelstrom below, and then suddenly the babiche cord about his wrist grew loose. The reaction almost threw him back. With the loosening of it, a cry came from Maret. It all happened in an instant, in almost less time than his brain could seize upon the significance of it. The slipping of her hands from the rock, the shooting of her white body away from him in the still whiter spume of the rapids. The rock had cut the babiche, and she was gone. With a cry that was like the cry of a madman, he plunged after her. The water engulfed him. He twisted himself up, freeing himself from the undertow. 20 feet ahead of him, 30. He caught a glimpse of a white arm, and then of Maret's face, before she disappeared in a wall of froth. Into that froth he shot after her. He came out of it blinded, groping wildly for her, crying out her name. His fingers caught the end of the babiche that was fastened about his own wrist, and he clutched it savagely, believing for a moment that he had found her. Thicker and more deadly, the rocks of the lower passage rose in his way. They seemed like living things, like devils filled with the desire to torture and destroy. They struck and beat at him. Their laughter was the roar of a Niagara. He no longer cried out. His brain grew heavy, and clubs were beating and breaking him into a formless thing. The rock drifts of spume, lather white, like the frosting of a monster cake, turned grey and then black. He did not know when he ceased fighting. The day went out, night came, the world was oblivion, and for a space he ceased to live. The shock of what had happened did not at once fall upon him. His first sensation was of awakening from a sleep that had been filled with pain and horror. Then he saw a black rock wall opposite him. He heard the sullen roar of the stream. His eyes fell upon a vivid patch of light reflected from the setting sun. He dragged himself up until he was on his knees. All at once, a thing that was like an iron hoop choking his senses seemed to break in his head, and he staggered to his feet, crying out Maret's name. Understanding inundated him with its horror, deadening his tongue after that first cry, filling his throat with a moaning, sobbing agony. Maret was gone. She was lost. She was dead. Swiftly, as reason came, his eyes took in his environment. For a quarter of a mile above him, he could see the white spume between the chasm walls, darkening with the approach of night. He could hear more clearly the roar of the death floods, but close to him was smooth water, and he stood now on a shelving tongue of rock and shale, upon which the current had flung him. In front of him was a rock wall. Behind him was another. And now the valley becomes memory, not distant, not lost, but gently settled. What once felt heavy now feels light. What once felt uncertain now feels clear. Silence has done its work, and you have allowed it to. If you are still awake, notice how quiet everything feels inside you. The wilderness has not only told a story, it has slowed your breathing, it has softened your thoughts. It has reminded you that calm does not need explanation. And yet, there are other valleys, other distant rivers, other quiet lands waiting in the dark. This story may rest, but the night continues, and in the next journey you will walk somewhere new, a different silence, a different path, a different quiet strength. The voice will remain steady. The pace will remain slow. The calm will remain yours. So when you are ready, return. Another long night awaits. Another story designed not to awaken you, but to carry you gently into sleep. For now, let your body sink deeper. Let the world grow distant. Let the memory of this valley fade softly into dream. Sleep deeply, and I will meet you again in the next quiet place.